To the fifth session of the GM support group. Today is going to be a little bit of a different format as we focus wholly on the topic of storytelling, and in particular how we craft our stories for our long-term campaigns. But first, we have a couple of brief announcements. First, and most important, is the fact that we have all of the VODs from our streams up on YouTube. Easiest way to find them is just to search for the GM's support group in YouTube, and should be pretty clear. I think it's usually the top one or two results. Don't know what order they do those in, but should be pretty easy to find. In addition, if you wish, when watching the videos on YouTube, there are always timestamps in the description that will let you jump to the section of the video that you are most interested in. And lastly, the last major announcement is that you can always ask us questions that we will answer in the third and final segment, or today, technically, it is the third today. We'll have a Q&A at the end of every session where we go through the questions that we've gotten in the last week. I have streamlined how I handle the emails a little bit. No longer will you have to worry about remembering what the subject line is. Just put in Q&A 2020 and we'll be able to get that found pretty quickly. Next year it'll change to 2021, which hopefully makes sense. Hopefully, yes. The last major announcement before we get started today is that towards the end of the month, the weekend after Thanksgiving would traditionally be our session for the week. I believe that's the 29th would be that session. That's 4 weeks from today. We will be taking that week off as a lot of people will be traveling for Thanksgiving, and some of us have other things going on that week in particular. I will also say that there is a chance we will be taking 2 weeks off from today as well. That would be the 15th. I'm taking part in National Novel Writing Month, and depending on how well that is or isn't going, I may need the extra time that prepping for this show takes to continue work on my book. So, the best way to find out if we are having a stream, first you can check out my Twitter. I will always talk about what's going on there, usually in the day or two beforehand. And if you are not a fan of that, you can always give a follow to the channel here on Twitch, and you will get notifications every time we go live. That's the surefire way to catch us when we are doing one of these sessions live. And I think, unless anybody else has something they want to talk about, that is the end of our announcements. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and dive into Behind the Screen, and away from the table, technically, as we get into the topic of crafting a story. Alright, so we are back. Today we're going to be talking about crafting a story, as I just said. And the most important thing to do before we get started, those of you who were with us last week, you know that we got a little passionate in our discussion of how to introduce characters, new characters, whether at the start of a story or somewhere in the middle. And things got a little complicated in our discussion of that. So we are dedicating the entirety of today's session to storytelling. Before we get started, though, we need to define a few things, because there are a lot of different ways that you can talk about how you write stories, especially for RPGs where you may get the general plot and your players direct things and so on. There are a lot of different ways that you can describe that. So let's go ahead and get a few definitions out of the way. Fizzer, I know that you had a few ideas that might actually simplify things quite a bit. Would you mind talking about your spectrum notion as far as that is concerned, if you still think that holds true enough?
Spectrum notion in regards to which topic?
With regards to the we were talking about, I believe it was plot, and open plot, closed plot, that whole spectrum.
I mean, my idea was more something I didn't have time for this week. I really wanted to sketch out like a ternary phase diagram of the different types of stories you can tell based on how you weight different aspects of storytelling and gaming. But I think the the central idea of storytelling having a spectrum of investment into who has narrative control is important.
Right. So the idea that you might have a spectrum where one end is an open plot, one end is closed plot, meaning that in a closed plot, the players don't have, in a perfectly closed plot, the players are basically just acting through a book.
Hmm.
In an open plot, the players make all of the choices. You might not even do any story writing, story crafting, as we're going to call it today, before the session begins.
I suppose you could think of that as two ends of which party in a game table is reactionary. On the closed plot side, the players are entirely reactionary to what the GM provides for them. On the other side, for a completely open plot, the GM is totally reactionary to what the players do.
That's a good way to think about it. So, in general, the reason we bring up definitions is I personally don't like the idea of a sandbox. Sandbox, for some people, can mean one thing. It can mean that it's much farther for some people on the open plot part of the spectrum than others. Some people have a wide range of what can define a sandbox. Some people have a narrow range. So we're trying to shy away from that definition in particular. And I think we all agree that sandboxes are more on the open end of the spectrum, in that players have the choice as to where the plot goes to a certain extent. But for some GMs compared to others, they might have less choice. It might be a little more directed, and so on and so forth. Does anyone have any other things? And maybe the easiest way to do this would be to, if someone is speaking and we're going to give everyone a 5-minute segment. When someone is speaking, if there's a word that they use that you think might have a different definition to you, that's the only time we'll allow interruptions in everyone's 5-minute segments. Does that sound fair? I think that might be easier than defining everything up front.
Sure.
All right.
I need to stop having dissenting opinions. Yeah, let's do that. Why not?
Dissenting opinions are fine, because there's no right or wrong way to do this. It all depends on your
I
table.
mean to this format.
Oh, to the format. Well, we can have that conversation afterwards.
It's fine. It's fine.
All right. So let's go ahead and dive into our 5-minute segments. Let's roll initiative and see who's going to be talking first about how you craft the story for your long-term campaigns.
Set of dice today.
Classic, average. All right. Who thinks they have the highest?
I got a 14.
I think that'd be you then.
It's probably you then. Who has? You have 11, you said?
Mm-hmm.
Walker?
I got 7.
I got 9, so I get to go third. Awesome. So, Fizzer, I think this probably makes sense. Why don't you go ahead and walk us through your process of crafting a long-term campaign, whether that's in D&D, Pathfinder, Numenera, whatever system you choose.
Am I allowed to also say what sandbox means to me?
Sure.
In this
Sure.
spiel? Okay.
You've got 5 minutes to do what you want.
Here we go. So, first off, when I run games, I really like chaos. My brain works better with it when there's a bunch of different chaotic things happening, and I find it more interesting to see how players respond to chaos and a bunch of different plot lines being pulled at the same time. There's an analogy made to drawn and quartering that I'm not going to go into. But I find that the game style that suits that is a type of sandbox. So by sandbox, I mean the world in which the players interact and explore has a bunch of different locations, and those locations all have their own small stories happening. When players encounter those different locations, they can choose to engage with the story there or bounce off of it. Or maybe they log it to go back to in the future. But the main plot that they encounter is either something that we agreed upon at the beginning of the game, or something that emerged within the first few sessions that allowed me to plot out something a bit longer. And as the game progresses, if they find things in this sandbox world that they explore with this driving plot, if they find something else they like more, they can steer into that plot from the one that they had chosen beforehand. I tend to approach it more from this feedback perspective of, once they tell me what they're interested in, I try and set up events in the world to conspire to make what they're interested in happen more. So if what they're interested in starts changing because they've found other things that maybe I didn't expect them to be interested in, or maybe I didn't think of when I originally, presented them with options, we can be a bit dynamic and start steering what's happening more towards what can be more dramatic. And I suppose that's the other half of what I really want to talk about, which is when I'm trying to write story for my games, I'm trying to think of what connects with the players, what connects with the world, and how can we build this to some kind of climax. Every session I run has ties into the rest of the world and like history, especially in Numenera. In Numenera, I have a vast world that has encompassed every campaign I've run. But when I run a game, I'm thinking of a campaign lasting about 6 months. I don't think I've had many campaigns last longer than that, because by the time I reach 6 months, I have a bunch of plot lines. They're all starting to tighten, and something has to give. And that's where the finale happens. How that finale works out, I usually leave up to what choices the players make. And this is more a mechanics approach. I write up different end states for if something is left unchecked. So if we have 3 big bad guys, one is an evil lich, another one is a vast underground like Myconid network conspiracy, and another one is just a rival human kingdom that is bent on conquering. If any one of those is left unchecked, you have very different end states. But the ways in which those are either halted or allied with or redirected make the finale more interesting. And each one could have been the thing that the players latched onto more, but I leave them all open to see which ones spark the most interest. Does that all make sense? I also don't know how long I've been talking for.
You've got about 45 seconds left in your 5 minutes, so you did pretty good there. And yeah, I think that makes sense.
That's about it.
I'll just do a brief commentary to summarize from what I understood, and then if you have something that I said wrong or misinterpreted, you can let me know. But it sounds like, well, first off, it sounds in general like that's very much the way that I tend to run my campaigns, although maybe I tend to have a little more of a broad focus than how your games are run. My games tend to run a lot longer than 6 months as well. Although there's no reason that has to be the case. If the players do something or dive into a plot line that ends up being shorter, it could be a 6-month campaign. But
I'm inclined to believe that's partially due to the nature of how Numenera functions, because Numenera's power curve is almost like a set of step functions rather than a smooth curve. If you are tier 1, the things that you take on are very different from when you're tier 3. And over the course of a campaign in 6 months, people will usually get to about tier 3 or 4. So you go from local to probably like inter-country conflicts, and going beyond that, you reach near demigod status. And I'm, as a GM, not super comfortable running demigod level power games.
Yeah, that's
a personal choice.
Things get a little odd when you get to that level.
It definitely does. It definitely does. Okay, so before we jump into Rob's segments, I want to remind people who are watching live on Twitch that if you have a question at any point during our show, feel free to go ahead and ask in chat, and as soon as we see it, at least at a reasonable time, we're not going to interrupt somebody who's speaking, we will address the question. You can also ask in the Q&A section at the end, live in chat, if you couldn't get your question in by email, and we'll do our best to answer it there. So without further ado,
So if
Rob,
I said something super weird,
feel free to ask
let
for
me know in chat.
clarification. Yeah. Rob, I believe you rolled next, so why don't you go ahead and walk us through your process?
So I agreed with a lot of what Fizzer had to say, and how he kind of looks at what a sandbox is, I guess. I think I personally keep it a bit more broad. You said something about having several different like storylines, I guess, and the player can interact with one or choose not to interact with it, and so on and so forth, I guess. But I think that also comes into the fact that you run a 6-month game, so the opportunity for storylines might be smaller just because of the pure time frame, if that makes sense. I don't versus a 2-year game, the opportunity to touch on 1,000 storylines is much easier over time to do than to have that opportunity to touch on that many, rather than 6 months where you physically don't have the time to maybe touch on that many storylines.
so you probably can touch on things much deeper in a longer campaign. Yeah.
And that's different, and that's the thing too. Yeah, exactly. And kind of going along exactly with what you said is your group finds something that they enjoy doing, and they either delve deeper, and that's what the story is about, or they touch it, they dabble in it, they do something with it, they find something else that they like on a tangent, and then they go into that. So so I definitely agree with that aspect of things. And you said that you liked like the chaos aspect of the game, whereas I personally don't know if I enjoy chaos, I guess, for instance. I don't know if the chaos is a good word for me to use personally. I definitely enjoy drama. I definitely enjoy interesting. I wouldn't say chaos. I don't know if chaos is something I would use to say
Intrigue,
on
maybe?
that. Yeah, intrigue. Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
For
But
your
more
games, maybe unexpected is the better word.
Unexpected.
Not
Okay,
necessarily
yeah.
chaotic, but
A
unexpected.
surprise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To fill in the definition of chaos, I meant I have between 3 and 7 plot lines all converging at the same point.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's a lot of
Yeah.
different motivations happening at the same time.
Gotcha. Yeah. See, and that's where I guess I differ a little bit, is because I might have 100 different plot lines that never converge ever, or 100 different plot lines that maybe only 2 or 3 of them converge, and the party may never ever see any of those. And that's kind of up to the party. And I think this is where it kind of gets into the bigger difference. Is you mentioned that you and the group of people that you're playing with kind of agree upon at the start of a game, kind of like a story-esque line of going into things, whereas that's where I kind of disagree, in the sense that I don't go into the players and I have no idea necessarily where the story is going to go. I know of an overall arching plot that I would like to convey, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I never ask my players like, oh, this is kind of what I want to. This is what I want to base the story about. Are you guys okay with that and following along? I basically just plot my players down in a setting. I know what my storyline wants to be, but it can take a complete right turn and be something completely different. There's no, like, as you said, quote unquote, agreed upon thing at the beginning of the game for me. And that's maybe where I lean farther, slightly farther to the right of the sandbox side of things, as opposed to the closed book side of things. If that makes sense, does that make sense?
Yeah, you're further along in the plot open spectrum as far as from the very beginning. And Fizzer, it sounded like you do that yourself from time to time, but you often also will choose.
Honestly,
plots
I
as a
fluctuate
beforehand.
through the campaign. I don't hold myself to being in one location.
Yeah,
Right.
But again, I think that all kind of stems from the idea of you see a campaign as being 6 months, whereas I see a campaign being 2 years, right?
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so I think a lot of that idea of how you see things being run, how you agree upon things, because like there would be no absolutely zero way of me trying to run this game that I'm running with the other group of people in 6 months. Like it's impossible. Like it's been 6 months and they barely touched the story. Like they're just now getting into the storyline type of the aspect of the game, and getting deeper and deeper into it. And so maybe our game speeds seem to be drastically different, which then leads to a much larger and different way of setting things up and running things and how you like to run things, if that makes sense. Yeah.
All right.
But I think that's about
any closing remarks? Yeah, we interrupted you a couple times for definition, so if you have any closing remarks, feel free.
No, like I think my last, I agree with a lot of what you had to say. I think I just lean a little bit more to the right open side more a little bit than perhaps you do. But again, solely on average, solely due to the fact that the time frame is so vastly different, and that's a big thing to note, I guess.
That definitely changes things.
It does.
It makes it harder to compare, because if you're only working for 6 months, if you're doing weekly sessions, you still have a good 22, 23 sessions, but that's still, I mean, my last game we had 56 sessions, which wasn't that much in hindsight, but we also had a pretty rapid pace in certain points of the campaign. But yeah.
Oh, there's one thing that I forgot to mention.
Sure.
Mentioning like your power curve. Something that I personally do, which I think Steven is going to talk about here in a little bit, at least he showed me a graph of it, is that I elongate and slow down the power curve on purpose. I do milestone XP, and so like I don't let my players level up as fast in what I consider the most important parts and more fun parts of like the leveling system, because D&D I guess is more of an exponential curve. Like once you get to level 20, you're in that demigod status, and I kind of agree with you in the sense that the game is less fun in that regard, in that area, and it is a little bit harder to control and DM from in that stage. So I enjoy keeping almost probably 60 to 75% of my overall story in the like level 7 to like 12 range or level 14 range. So you can spend a year just in level 7 to 14 in my type of game. I can't really setting.
I've never had players that patient.
I guess
it depends a lot on your
depends on the
group.
player.
And
our group is definitely a unique group. I mean,
we have a good group.
3.5 years almost, right? So,
and that is something important to note, that all of the things we're talking about depend a lot on the group that you're playing with. Some players just want to fight monsters and level up and get powerful, and in that case, a 6-month campaign might be perfect. You do 3 sessions or 1 session at level 1, 1 session at level 2, and then no more than 3 sessions at every other level. Something like that could work really well, but it all depends on the type of players you have.
Right. And then was it one thing for Rob, the longer campaign versus shorter campaign, that you mentioned touching on more story threads? I think it's less to do with touching on them, because you can do that just as well in a 6-month, but closing those threads is the big difference between year-long and
delving deeper into them. Exactly.
Which actually might feed into why my campaigns end in such chaos, because I want to end more of those, and it leads to
But see, the thing is, I leave it up to the player. I leave it up to the player to end those more so than me wanting to end those. So if a player, if the group starts something and then says, "Okay, we're going to leave and go do something else," the group does that. It may have consequences that may tie in later on or something like that. It may not, and that's just kind of how it turns out,
Right. But yeah, I saw that as a big difference between the two of you, as in closing those threads instead of having them all tied together, like you were saying, Fizzer, and have that more chaotic ending. And that was a big difference between the shorter and the longer in my mind.
Stephen, if you don't mind, what do you all think about, because this seems to be coming up a bit already, players versus GMs closing storylines? Do storylines just close naturally in the worlds that you run, or are they dependent on players interacting with them?
I think that's going to depend GM to GM. So maybe
which is
that's
why
something.
I'm asking you all.
Right. For our games, let's just give a brief thing going around clockwise, which is cheaper than going by bus, and say whether or not, on average, does the GM close more plot lines or do the players close more plot lines? So, Rob, you're top left in everyone's screen.
My answer is both. It is up to the players to close a plot line, but just because they don't close a plot line doesn't mean it doesn't close, and that's where the GM closes it, whether the players know it or not. Now, when the GM and the players go down a story together and it does finish because the players finished it, then again, that's both. Yes, at that point, the GM is making the plot line come to an end. So, I mean, a GM can always make something go on forever, right? 37 seasons of a freaking episode on Netflix. You know that as well as anyone else, right? So I think the answer is a lot of both. The players can close something. Oh, yeah, pretty. I actually wouldn't say even, because like I said, I might have 1,000 different plot lines in the story that the players might only touch 10 of them. That doesn't mean that the other 1,000 different plot lines aren't going to happen. And it just means the players never knew about it, right? And out of those 10, the players can only maybe close 3 of them because that's what they were most interested in, right? So the players might have closed 3 of them. They might have touched on 10.
GM closes 7, sure.
GM closes 7, sure. You know what I mean?
All right.
Or I would actually say the GM helps close 10, the 7 that the players didn't finish,
right,
3 the players. You know what I mean?
Yeah, the GM's involved in all of them, but
the GM's involved in everything, and it's up to the GM to help the players close what they are kind of going into.
Focused on, sure.
Focused on, exactly. So my answer is really a lot of both. But if I had to lean towards one, the GM's always going to close more plot lines, just and especially in a longer campaign. Just because, there's probably stuff in Steven's game that we maybe touched on, and then
you'll see it next. You'll see it my next campaign.
Yeah, and that was it. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so like if it was it's the GM that closes things that the players never see, so they'll always close more. In my opinion, the players would.
All right, Fizzer, what do you think of that? I think that's
I asked my question poorly. I meant, okay, so my picture for this is the players, meet a character on the side of the road. They decide not to interact with them beyond, like, getting, oh, this is your deal. Then maybe another 2 sessions later, they meet up with a character again. Character's lost an arm. And they're like, oh, man, how'd you lose your arm? Like, okay, this thing happened to them. So there are things happening in the background that don't require the players to be there. And eventually maybe either that character dies or becomes a villain or something else happens. And it's, I guess, a quantum mechanics, do the players need to observe it for it to be a valid plot line?
Right.
And
exactly does it end with their observation?
Yeah. And that's what I was getting from what Rob was saying as well, was that
So in my case, I'd say, like, as the GM, the world is closing its own plot lines under my direction,
right?
About 60% of the time.
Yep.
But the 40% of the time that the players are involved, that's where you get that high drama that brings out
of course
player sacrifice, that sort of thing.
You can still have high drama moments, right? If a player,
like a political aspect of things was happening maybe behind the scenes, even when the players weren't involved, but kind of came to a head, and then the players had to get involved. But like the drama part of it happened behind the scenes, right? Like
however, some of the drama that did occur was
player
greater.
Caused.
Well, that, and it was some of the things that you guys didn't interact with became more dramatic because you didn't interact with it. You didn't choose to go to Korova in the beginning of my campaign and deal with the Emperor and try and negotiate peace. You decided to leave it alone and go explore a dungeon. And what happened? The war lasted for 6 months. That's significantly more dramatic than if you guys had negotiated peace in a month. So it definitely depends. But I think, having played with all of you, and Fizzer having heard what you just said, I feel like we all agree that there are things that happen in the world whether the players engage with it or not. And, you might write 100 different plot lines that can be happening. They engage with 10. You might have 10 more that they didn't interact with that actually occur behind the scenes. And you might have 80 that you leave for another campaign. There's always things like that can go through. But we are running a little lower on time. The numbers can change from GM to GM. It's all good. We've still got about 10 minutes, which should leave myself and Walker enough time to go through our thing, and still a little bit of conversation. But we've touched on some really good things, and it definitely changes from GM to GM. And there's no one right way to do it, because every table is different, and everything can change depending on...
Every party is different, every GM is different. It's just how it culminates together.
Right. So the way I run my games is pretty similar. It's kind of a mix of both of Fizzer and Rob. I like to get my characters, or my player characters, to give me full backstories, a page or two of backstory. And before we sit down for our first session, I try and do my best to weave them into something that, where are the connections, where might something come in the story. Once that happens, even before I know what the player characters are, I have a set beginning. So I just wrote this for my next campaign. Whenever that happens, I don't even know who's going to be playing in it. But I know you guys are starting in the town of Colfell in the country of Thirima. So they're starting there. It's very, very closed. They have a few different things that they can choose to do. And for the first few levels, it's sort of a closed plot. They can, veer left and right a little bit, but until they reach a pretty decent spot in that small starting story, there's no focus. Or it's entirely focused, sorry. After that point, my story broadens, and they might have 5 or 6 different threads that they can choose to go down. Some of them might happen again while they're not interacting with them. Others might not happen at all because it might be more interesting for a later campaign. And the story remains broad until, if I'm doing a 20 level campaign, it stays broad until about the 10th level. Where eventually by that point, I should know roughly what the players are interested in and have kind of written the story ahead of time to meet up with where they are going themselves already. And I've gotten pretty good at that, I think. But it's always trial and error. After 10th level, things start to narrow down, and it keeps narrowing down eventually until the end of the campaign. Now, I will say, I have written 2 main plot points that could be used for my next campaign. I don't know if I'll use either of them. The main plot might not appear until I've seen how the players work in those first 3 levels. That's what I use the first 3 levels for, is to figure out what the players are most interested in with their characters, what they're choosing to interact with in terms of my world. One of the main plot points I've dealt with is heavily based in religion. Another one is heavily based in politics. If it turns out that they're more interested in combat, or they're not interested in the religion of my world, but the structure of magic, then I might write a third plot point. And it all entirely depends on how those first 3 levels go. But that's generally how I run my games. And, the scale at which plot grows more focused or grows more broad depends on a lot of things. If I don't want to do a 20 level game, I might do, it's very broad until 7th level, and you end at 15. It's very malleable as far as what I can do with it, and all of that again depends on the first 3 levels.
But so, in general, it has that kind of diamond shape where it
right. It's not as strict as a diamond, and it goes out and it goes back in. I can actually show a little graphic on screen. This is roughly what the shape of my stories look like, and I'll post this in the description on the YouTube video. So if you want to look through this and read through this, feel free. But this is just the way that I like to run my campaigns, and I think it works pretty well as a writer. It's something that I've become very interested in as far as how the story works.
Okay. So very opposed to, as Fizzer has chaotic or massive ending with multiple storylines. It's more of a tailored.
Once they've
got
gotten
their interest, and you go to that interest to the final point.
Yeah. So the players do choose what sort of stories they like, and I like to tell them a story. I like adventures that are heroic in nature. I don't like necessarily playing with people who won't do the right thing when push comes to shove. It might take them a while to get to that point, but those are the stories I like to tell. So I tell my players going into things, especially after the first campaign, where some of that wasn't as clearly stated as it should have been, and some of the characters were a little on the grayer side, which made it a little difficult in places. But I tell my players going into that from now through my future campaigns.
Okay.
Because those are the stories I
Makes
like
sense.
to tell. So
Yep. And that makes it easier to write the stories in the beginning. Okay.
All right, Walker, I
You're last,
believe
Walker.
you are last.
Yeah, and it's interesting seeing. I've been writing notes about what all you do, and it's interesting to see some things that I very much agree with and some things that I don't. I've done now one homebrew and one more, or started one more on a module. And what I've noticed for when I do a homebrew and I have control over the whole story, and the way that I like to do it is I tie the story to the world. I'll have a completely different world for every story that I will tell. And that's the way that I bring everything together. So at the very beginning, I start with an idea of something, a larger overarching concept that I want to explore as a GM and make an interesting story. And I make that tied to some of the larger machinations of the world that my players are in. So wherever they go, they'll run into something related to this overarching plot, but it's still entirely up to them whether or not they choose to interact with it, because there's plenty of other stuff as well. And I leave that as there is a timeline to the campaign where if they do or do not do certain things, this will happen. And it's how the world is built. The world is built around this story where what the players choose to do will affect that story, or it could be entirely cursory to the story and they can go off and do whatever they're going to do, and suddenly the world explodes and they have no idea why.
Or we end up in
But-
a crystal city that gets teleported to a different plane.
Yeah, and things happen. But I leave a lot of open-endedness to, after I build the world around the story and I flesh out some of the major points, I'll start building the rest of the world around it. I'll have towns, I'll have characters, I'll have all of them, and I'll know in my mind where they are related to that story or whether they're doing their own thing. I like to have separate side stories where there's still a larger overarching theme or larger overarching thing that's happening, but it could be either connected to or entirely separate from the overarching world core story. And I like to, when I had my players come in, and I played with it for a while before I actually started having you guys interact with it, but I like to have a backstory to the characters that were coming in for my players. So I could say, okay, based on what you want, this is where you would fit in my world. Does that sound good to you?
Mm-hmm.
So for the two of you, you were the what's your last name?
Kranix brothers.
Kranix
yeah.
brothers. So you wanted to be brothers from a half-orc tribe. So I was like, okay, you want to be in a half-orc tribe? There is one of those here. You'd know about this area, and that's where you get your start. And I asked you more about, okay, this is where you started. What did you do in that area? And then you expand and you interact with the world a little bit more, a little bit less than maybe some of the others. And that kind of shapes how you start the story.
Yeah.
And then I come to the point where everybody comes together. And the way I like to do it is tie a little bit of the overarching world story to the back of each character. So even if they have nothing else in common, they have something drawing them to some sort of element of plot.
Right.
Where the story that's going over the edge that I kind of want to tell is there. They can interact with it. They have a reason that they should interact with it, but they can still do whatever else they choose to do. And the story evolves. So I like to think that I'm a little bit closer to a closed story than an open story with the way that I do things in a sandbox. But I like that because it gives purpose and it keeps things moving. The other thing that I notice that I do differently than all of you is I don't plan an ending timeline, like real world wise, tied to the campaigns that I'm running. So I'd never think in the back of my head, oh, I want this to go 6 months. Oh, I want to go this for a year. I just think, all right, when this story ends, it ends.
That's a good point.
That's along the same lines. Like I have an idea that my idea is like it could last about 2 years, but
it could end in 3 months, and there's no way to know.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I think that is the point we need to clarify. We, at least for me, and it sounds like Rob is the same way, we don't necessarily choose for the plot to go 2 years, but they generally end up longer. It's not necessarily a strict 2-year thing, and
and
it moves at the
I
speed
don't
of
have
plot.
a 6-month cutoff.
Right.
But I think due to the nature of how Numenera scales, 6 months is when that like
a little more average.
that power curve intersects with a climax point.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And I just think and when I'm planning things, I know when in the timeline things are going to happen in the world that I have created.
Mm-hmm.
But I have no concept of how long it's going to take my players to get there. And when they get there, they could be woefully ill prepared because they rush to get there, and suddenly they're dealing with a demon from another plane that's trying to destroy the world. And they're like, well, shit.
Yeah.
Or they could be on par where it's going to be a difficult encounter and they have a chance of succeeding, and that's wonderful. Or they could be supremely overpowered and this demon comes through and they just kind of smack him back into his plane, and that's the end of the story for that section of the story. But the way that, and we were talking about closing storylines, I don't think any storyline is entirely closed until the GM says it is closed.
Right.
Yeah,
The players interact
exactly
with them.
Yeah, exactly.
Because no matter what they do, the way that Magic and D&D and many of these systems work, just because someone's dead doesn't mean they're gone. Just because someone's vanished doesn't mean it's gone forever.
Exactly. There could be 32. There could be 32 seasons to a 2-season episode if the GM decides to make it so. Right.
Exactly, and that can go where after the way I look at it and the way that I would run it, we never kind of got to that point. It would be after we get to one of those climax points, I would ask the group, okay, do you want to continue with this story? Mm-hmm. Are there things that you still want to do? Are there storylines that you still want to follow through? And if they are, we'll continue playing and see what happens.
Mm-hmm. Huh. I like that as a tactic. So when you set up
an optional break-off point,
right?
In the story, like you know what, the Kranix brothers, we killed our necromancer.
Yep, killed Bargdir. We're done.
We set out.
We're out.
We set out
Peace.
what we're trying to do, and like
that's where I typically put like a season break, as if it was a TV show.
You can think of it that way, and it would go the same with the players. If the player thinks that their character's storyline has reached its logical conclusion and they no longer want to be a part
of the actor's been
of
fired.
The adventuring group,
then the actor's been
done with that storyline. They come in with a new character if they so desire, or they can depart entirely.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah.
So when you have
that particular aspect of things.
Yeah.
So when you have this like
really true.
Central tension in your games, Walker, you've got an idea, and if I understand it right, you allow that tension to permeate the other like plot lines that you seed the world with.
Exactly, because I don't want to say too much about the one that I made because there's still a chance we may come back to it. I've finally got my notes back from Korea, so I was gonna kind of pull all that together and see where it ends up. But the way I started it is I make a landmass or separate bits of landmass that is my world, and then I think, okay, how did these landmasses come to be? What's the overarching, like, on the level of gods and extraplanar beings beyond what is happening? And how did that lead to the civilizations where they are right now? And that dictates a lot of the political, the inner character, NPCs, the cultural aspects of different regions and different things. So I have, kind of before I really start going, a good idea of what each area is going to look like based on the massive overarching plot.
So quick point of clarification. Sorry, Rob.
No,
you make a new world for every campaign?
Oh, absolutely. Like the one that I made for y'all.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as that one's done or we decide to do something else, it's going to be an entirely different world.
That's a lot of work.
That is a lot of work.
I understand that, but I like the way that's there because everything in the world has a purpose. Nothing is, the vestigial to a previous story.
Right. And I definitely get that. I'm making whole other continents for my worlds for future campaigns, and I guess it's sort of a similar idea, but they're all still tied into a central ethos of my world itself. And it's the same world that I write my books in. So
right, I like being able to change everything from a story to story. So entirely new pantheon of gods, entirely new conflicts between, if there's devils, demons, are they on the same page? Are they not?
Gotcha.
It's entirely new every time, and I like that it's a fresh story that the players, while they may have some idea what's coming because they know how I like to run a campaign, they really don't know the detail of what's coming or how specific things are going to interact.
Sure.
See, I'm completely opposite in that regard. I like building on top of previous things. Like I told my players from the start of this game here, if they survive and they become level 20 and they do everything, they will become quote unquote demigods in my world, or
Right.
even lesser gods for some people that are of the clergy. But like if another set of players comes in that I DM for, and they're like, I want Styles to be my god, and they say, okay, I pray to Styles to help me do this XYZ. I will literally call Steven up and say, someone is praying to you and asking you to help them in this regard. This is kind of what their character is. This is what they're doing, et cetera. Do you want to help them? And I will literally bring Styles back into the game as Steven into the, like, for a one shot or a two shot or whatever, and have like that. And so I definitely enjoy the building on top of the aspect. Like I think that is super awesome to have that kind of your consequences make an everlasting, or your decisions make an everlasting mark, whether it's a positive or a consequence, right?
And
so
for
I
group
think I
of
straddled those ideas.
people, that makes a difference.
Right.
Whether it's if you have those same people beyond their characters in your group going forward, in your like larger group of people that you talk to or interact with, that's great. It's just I feel like some of it is lost if, like, let's say it's Styles that's a god for them, but you can't get into touch with Steven. Suddenly you're acting in place of Styles.
True, but it's still a character that he's seen as a GM. He knows how that character tends to act, how to think, so on and so forth.
Right.
Now, I hate to be a killjoy. But we do really have to move on to our monster identification challenge, especially, Rob, since you're on a timeline today.
Yeah, I mean, I have to leave in 13 minutes.
So. Yeah, we better get moving on. So, we'll be right back with the Roll Initiative Monster Identification Challenge. Have your pens and paper ready.
Boy.
And because I was going from a different scene, we didn't have a transition. Cool. Monster ID Challenge is a game where we have 3 rounds, and you guys, including you at home, have 4 opportunities to guess what monster I'm describing. So, I generally recommend, and I didn't do anything fancier than last time, you have 3 columns, 4 rows each, enough space to write down the name of a monster. If in the first round you think that I'm describing a blue dragon, write down blue dragon. If you still think I'm describing a blue dragon, in the second round, write down blue dragon. And so on. Because every time that you get it right, each line you get it right, you'll get more points. If you guess it early, you'll get a lot of points. You guess it late, you'll get a few points. Our first...
I'm going to guess right now, it's a green dragon.
Our first categories, I'll always discuss resistances and immunities. The second will be what type of creature, so celestial, fey, fiend, undead, aberrations, monstrosities, so on and so forth. The third, I'll go through the bolded actions and traits. And lastly, I'll give you guys a silhouette. So, for the Monster ID Challenge, let's go ahead and get started. I gotta open up some things. I am semi-prepared for this. I think I'm prepared for this. Alright, please don't show up on the screen. That would be awful.
I am ready to fail.
These all generally are from the Monster Manual, so hopefully there won't be too many issues there. But, round 1, let's say that this creature has the condition immunity of prone. It is immune to being prone. And when there's, few things, I'll also give you senses. It also has dark vision to 60 feet. So yeah, it is not able to be prone, and it has dark vision out to 60 feet. Not a lot to go on. But you could guess right.
No resistances whatsoever.
No resistances whatsoever, which does indeed tell you something.
Interesting.
I'll tell you as well, it's a CR2.
Wow.
Can still get some interesting things at CR2.
Wait, what is that one called?
You have 10 seconds.
I don't know if this is a CR2. I'm going to say not.
Alright, write your guesses down. For our second category, this same monster is of the type aberration.
Maybe.
This is an aberration.
what? I don't know names. I name stuff the way I want to.
All right, 10 seconds. All right, third category. It's bolded abilities, so traits and actions. This has the traits Aberrant Ground, Gibbering, Multi-Attack, Bites, and Blinding Spittle.
Cool.
That one should be easier for a lot of you.
Yep.
All right, and we're going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, hold on. Go full screen, please. There we go.
Oh.
Okay.
Oh.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
I
Excellent.
see a piece of wood.
Yes,
Yep.
you should. Now you get the silhouette of the creature. This is what it looks like in silhouette.
Aunt Agatha.
Excuse me.
You have about 10 seconds. All right. I'm not actually counting seconds. So let's see if you got it right. This is a gibbering mouther.
Hey.
Spelling doesn't matter. So for the first line, if you got it right, it's worth 7 points. Second line is worth 5. Third is worth 3, and the last line is worth 1. So go ahead and tally up your total points for each column or each line, and by the end of the third round, we'll have a total number of points.
Yeah, I got from the actions correct. The first I was thinking is that thing that like hangs from the ceiling and drops like a
The
spike.
Ropers, or
Yeah, I was
yeah.
thinking something similar. Yeah.
It's good thought.
Like
good thought.
what can't be prone because it's stuck to the ceiling. But
All right.
I was thinking the opposite thing. I was thinking that this thing was like either like a golem or something that it just couldn't be. Like it was just impossible to move it, you know?
All right. Let's move on to round
that does
2.
bring to mind a golem on its back like a turtle.
Which is funny. So round 2, immunities or damage immunities and condition immunities and resistances if necessary. It is immune to poison. It's also immune to being charmed, exhausted, frightened, paralyzed, and poisoned. Got about 10 seconds, just so we don't go over time. All right, make sure your guesses are in. This thing, for the second line, is a construct.
Oh, I'm not.
Well, I was very off.
Yeah, me too.
So much as I'm immune to poison.
I don't really do a whole lot with constructs, dang.
No, that's not a
A
construct.
few more seconds. Write down your best guesses.
That's probably a construct.
All right. So for the third line, we have the traits and actions, just the bold text. This thing has bound, regeneration, spell storing, multi-attack, fist, and shield.
I am very far off.
Captain America?
How'd you know?
You're not far off, I don't think.
So lost.
Just a few more
If
seconds.
there's anyone in the audience, please find me. Help. Please.
All right, and our fourth chance to get it right. Here is this thing's silhouette.
It's fucking Optimus Prime.
I've seen this before.
Yes.
It's Optimus Prime.
All right, write down your final guesses. We have a reveal in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. This thing
Yep.
is a shield guardian.
Yeah, I got it.
That's funny considering Cap. Yeah.
Yeah, I would take anything that has shields, and that's like if you wrote shield golem, I'd take that.
Would you take Bending Rodriguez?
I have no idea what that is in reference to, so no.
That's
You need to watch Futurama at some point, dude.
I'm good. I'm good. All right, so go ahead and tally up that column, and we move on to round 3. This one is going to be interesting.
Oh, brother.
In round 3, this thing...
That's going to be interesting. What were the other two?
This thing has immunities to cold damage and fire damage. It does not have any other immunities or resistances, so I'll tell you its senses and its challenge rating. It has dark vision to 60 feet, tremor sense to 60 feet, and is a CR 11 creature.
Oh.
Get up that high.
Fire and cold. Huh.
Write down your best guesses. Alright, we move on to line 2. This creature is a monstrosity. And I'll tell you, just because that doesn't necessarily say much, it is huge. It is a huge monstrosity.
I'm on the right track.
I think so as well.
Write down your best guesses. On to line 3. Traits, actions, reactions, if it has them. Bold text only. Heated body, bite, and swallow.
Alright, I'm on less of a right track.
Yeah.
About 5 seconons.
I'm just making stuff up at this
That's
point.
fine. That's fine.
Oh,
maybe we'll get a new monster to make for the 5-minute design challenge.
I'm back on a good track.
All right. Now on to line 4. The silhouette. This one was a pain in the neck to do.
Yeah,
Oh.
got it.
I
Write down
don't
your
think
best
I've
guesses.
Seen that one.
I was flipping through my monster manual and I
Oh.
found something cool. So
I mean,
Definitely
you
not
do about
spelling this
10
right.
seconds. Spelling doesn't matter. It's mostly context that matters. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. This creature is a Remoraz.
Got it.
dang.
Let's go. Thank you, Critical Role.
Oh, those fuckers.
Yep. These guys are not a lot of fun. Anything that touches the Remoraz with a melee attack takes 3d6 fire damage. They also like to swallow things. Their bites do 6d10 plus 7 damage with an additional 3d6 fire damage. It's a DC 17 grapple check to escape. And
Would you
being
accept
swallowed,
a-
you take... What?
Would you accept a fireworm as a?
I'll give you half
two?
points. I'll give you half points.
I'll take that as well then.
Yeah, rounded down.
Hooray.
Half points rounded down.
Okay, I got a point for that last one then.
All right, so go ahead and now sum up the total score for all 3 columns, and
What
we
were the
will see
last
who's
two
the winner.
columns, did you say? What are the point scores for the last two?
So
3
it's
and 1.
7, 5, 3, 1 going down for each row.
Okay. All right, I didn't get 0 across the board.
That's
happy.
good. This one was a more
Hey.
challenging set than the last time we went through the Monster ID challenge.
You got
6 points, pretty good. Can anyone beat 6? You got 4.
I only got 4.
Very
I got
respectable.
9.
9. Very nice. All right, and let's see if anybody in chat has a score for us. Anybody playing along at home want to share your score? We'll see if there's anybody who can beat a 9 before the end of the stream. Rob, thanks very much for coming and joining us. I know you got to head out. We're going to go ahead and go through the Q&A that we have and wrap things up here in the next 5 or 10 minutes.
Alrighty, well, you guys have a great rest of the day. Bye, everybody listening.
Adios.
And
Thanks for
I'll catch you
joining.
next time. Bye.
See you later, Rob.
All right, I'm going to stop that. Okay, and on to the Q&A. Actually, I'm going to leave us here, but yeah, because now everything's just in the wrong place. So we're gonna stay here without our names. Hopefully you know who we are by now. Steven Fizzer's in that box. Nope, wrong way, that box. And Walker's down below. So our question for today, got to get back to that window, get out of Acrobat, comes from Echo. And Echo asks, how do you go about determining the DC for different aspects of the game, including saves to custom items, and so on? From the Dungeon Master's Guide, they give you the baselines from easy to near impossible in increments of 5. But how do you determine, for example, a DC is 17 or 22 instead of just going with 15 or 20? Now, that is a very good question.
Yep.
That is a very good question. And I have a good answer, I think, to start with. It really depends on if I want my players to pass or fail. If it's something that, on average, they should get to do and should be able to pass it successfully, I'll look at the best person's score in that category. So if it's an intelligence save and they've got a rogue, they may have a +7. On average, you roll an 11, that makes it an 18. So the rogue should pass an 18 about half the time. But then I'll probably drop it down a couple ticks because I want a few other people to possibly pass as well. That I don't ever use the notion of, easy as a 5. I don't go by 5s at all. That's how I decide all of my difficulty classes in D&D. I just look to see on average what are they going to roll. If they have advantage, if I want them to have to roll a 15 or higher on the base dice, I'll look at who's got what score and go from there.
Okay, that's a good way to do it. I actually like the way that D&D has the rough guideline of how difficult it should be by the number value. I never assign a hard value to a task, usually. I'll have, like you're saying, more based on what's the best that they could do with their best person doing it, as if it's impossible, it'll be on the very edge of what they're able to do, or maybe even bonded if it's just entirely impossible. But I like looking at the levels of, is it closer to being moderately difficult or hard? Is it closer to being hard than impossible? And I'll kind of scale it in my head from there.
And I will say I technically do the same thing, but I don't use their guidelines. I look at the statistics of rolling a d20.
Right.
So,
and then some things I've gotten better lately about, if it's something that is so mundane that their character should be able to do it, I won't have them roll for it.
Yeah. I'm not very useful for this because I learned all of my scaling from Numenera, which runs on a different scaling system, and explicitly says, sometimes you don't need to tell the players what the DC is until they roll, because it's aimed more towards narration.
That's true for D&D as well, though. I hardly ever tell the players what they have to roll to succeed at something, unless it's something that is important, like incredibly important. If it's a saving throw that it's going to mean their life if they fail.
Like
things like that I'll tell them, but otherwise I almost never mention what the DC is.
Those are a little different.
Yeah.
So on one side, you can think of setting DCs and basically passing thresholds from an outcome standpoint of like, okay, what do I hope happens when they encounter this? But the other thing, and I use this more when I'm making items, is how frequently do I want this to happen?
Mm-hmm.
Because a frequency of, say, a charisma save of 18 for a third level party, it's not easy. And if it's a charisma save against being enchanted, that means basically when that ability or when that item is activated, you're taking somebody out of the fight.
Right.
And it can act as a very quick extinction for an encounter. So if I think about a a DC that's higher or lower, I kind of plot a 1 over X graph, if you can think of it that way, in terms of like what frequency of interaction do I really want.
Okay, that's a good way to do it, honestly.
Yeah, another useful thing to mention is that you don't have to have hard DCs. You can have a DC for, all right, what's the best case scenario? They need to hit this. That might be a 14. It might not be, or sorry, that might be a higher number. If the best case scenario is going to happen, it might be a DC 20. They might not hardly ever make that. But then they could still do something good in the 16 to 20 range, and they fail below 16. There's a lot of different ways that you can handle DCs, and it mostly depends on exactly what you're trying to do. I generally only do those gated difficulty checks when the possibility of a failure is interesting, or rather, the possibilities between success and failure are more interesting than just a pass or fail.
Yeah, pass fail is boring. The degrees of success is the way to go.
Yeah.
Which actually is how Numenera works, because it's every 3 on the D20 is another level of success or mastery of the task.
Yeah, and it's something I've leaned into. Star Trek Adventures does that. I think in general, Modiphius 2D20 system works with that. And Walker, after our game of Cthulhu Confidential with the Gumshoe 1-to-1, most of the things that are interesting are those sort of gated challenges. And I really like that. That's something that I will probably use for the rest of my time that I run D&D. It's just, it makes things a lot more interesting.
Yeah.
So, thanks, Echo, for that question. And again, for those of you at home, guess I got to go back to this with the wrong names for a second. Actually, I can mute all of the names. There we go. If you want to ask us a question before the next session, go ahead and send us an email at this email address with this subject line, and we will be sure to get to it. Sorry.
Is it all right if I bring up one final question that was sparked by earlier discussion?
Sure.
Considering the more narrative and reactive ways you can begin or end a game, what do you do about prophecies?
Prophecies are a lot of fun. They're challenging to do right, I would say, but especially for people who can't rhyme like me, or who can't do anything in verse like me. That's stuff that players in my games have not gotten into before. Not really. But there are elements of prophecies that actually happened in my first campaign that I think you guys heard, but didn't really investigate a whole lot. But yeah, prophecies are a lot of fun to work with.
Those in a world like mine are a lot of fun because since the entire world is tied to an overarching thread, you can make prophecies have more impact than if things were a little bit more dynamic. So you could give an inclination that something is going to happen a certain way because unless they interact and change it, it is going to happen that way. And it's set up so you can do that with a lot of different things in my worlds. But they're fun.
They are a lot of fun.
Do you set up a prophecy with a meaning in mind? Or do you create a prophecy with words that could associate with things, but haven't been set yet?
For me, it depends a lot on how clever I am in the moment.
Yeah.
If it's a prophecy that relates to a main plot points, I will absolutely write, something pretty specific and try to use vague terminology. There have been a couple of times where I've written a prophecy that was incredibly non-specific that could relate to the party. It could also relate to Joe Schmo next door.
Was that the song?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That one you guys had a lot of fun with.
Yeah.
The whole dead bandit or the whole dead trooper group that you tracked into the woods.
If you tie enough of it to things that they have seen or think that they've seen, they really it like absorbs everything you think about because it's like, oh shit, did they think about this? Are we doing exactly what the prophecy said we were going to do without even thinking about it? Oh my god, what's the next step?
It can also be fun to throw in a twist. If you throw in a twist, something that everything matches perfectly, but there's one line that should have happened like 4 months ago if it's a linear story that didn't happen.
Right.
Those are always fun to work with too, because then the players start to think, wait a minute, this sounds exactly like us, but that wasn't us.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean? It's a really fun thing to play with.
Yeah.
Good question.
These are the best times when you just like stay silent and watch them, freak out a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So I will say, for anyone who is in the Twitch chat, since we are in the question and answer portion of the show here, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask us live, now would be a good time for it. And thanks for everybody for yeah, absolutely. Thanks for everybody who's been interacting in chat. It definitely makes the show a lot more fun to produce. But yeah, any questions? Generally give about 15 to 20 seconds. That's what
There's
my
a bit of a
teacher
string
brain
delay.
says.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
While we wait, I'm gonna read out a prophecy that I came up with on the spot that turned into the climax of a full season of my game.
That's good.
A general and scout in opposition finally work together. The orb of souls is lost until sea becomes sky. The twilight omen brings the spear of pain. When stars fall, death shall become as life, and the blade of knowledge shall be returned. When patterns and dance break and bend, the empress of prisms shall perish. So the sundered king comes home.
That's good. That's good. Should I, Walker? Should I share the song that you guys found, the prophecy song?
Yeah.
All right. Two neighbors, never quite friends, quarreled in enmity. Their houses built on shifting sands, never noticed. First's father cruel, second's softer rule. Peril, as shifting sands, sifting man. The 8 who are never 8, sometimes 6, 5, and 6, and once again. They mix, transfix, and heal the rift. 2 are 1, so 3 are 2. Such a house can be 2, else all be filled of woe, enter foe. I was quite pleased with that one.
You went deep in the math there.
I did. I did.
And we played with the math for a while.
Yeah.
No, wait, that doesn't quite make sense.
You never caught the fact that we had a player join the campaign for like a month or two, and you were at that time 6, and you so on had a total of 8 characters, but never had 8 actual characters in the game at once. You never caught on to that fact until afterwards.
We had forgotten about that, honestly.
Yeah. We have a question. Echo again. Do you use the CR calculation in the DM guide for encounters? Not directly. I always use something like Kobold Fight Club. It's my go-to. There's also an extension for Fantasy Grounds that will calculate it based on the characters that are in the party sheet, which is incredibly helpful. And it'll calculate general difficulties based on the calculations in the DM's guide, but I never do anything by hand. The way that works is just not effective. It's too much math for the average person to do for every encounter.
I do it on the fly.
I'm impressed. I use Kobold Fight Club and I just monkey around with it until I think, oh, that could be an interesting and dramatic fight.
Yeah.
Thanks for putting the link in chat, Fizzer.
Yeah. What was it?
It's bookmarked.
For CR calculations, I picked something that would by itself be a challenge for 1 or 2 characters based on what their abilities are, and then I build a couple of minions or lieutenants or however you want to think about it, where they've got enough to spread the damage and make it a challenging encounter.
And a lot of that does depend on what you're looking for. If you want a 1 creature encounter, remember that you have to divide the number of things by 2 or something like that if it's only 1 creature. So
actually,
it gets
the action economy really disfavors a single opponent.
That being said, there's a great rule system in Mythic Odysseys of Theros for mythic monsters. So if you're fighting 1 creature, I definitely recommend taking a look at that. It gives them, and I kind of used this in the one-shot I ran a couple weeks ago, Walker. The monster will have once they reach 0 hit points, they'll regen to a certain level, and mythical traits about them will activate. and that gives you a greater duration of the fight. Makes it not just a one round and done sort of thing. And it can give them some really interesting things to do. The players might go in saying, hey, this is a Hydra. We've fought a Hydra before. And then it turns out to be the Hydra. So it's a really fun system to play with, and I definitely recommend taking a look at it.
And all others are pretenders.
Yeah. But yeah, there's a lot of different things you can do to kind of homebrew monsters to get them to fit just right.
Yeah. Always, if you want to use something that seems like it might be a little bit too much of a challenge with your current party, you can play with their the addition to their attack and the DC of what they do, and bring it in more into the realm that is something they can actually deal with.
Right.
Look at what your characters have for the DC for the spells that they cast and the attack bonuses they have on their attacks,
and you can adjust things
to
fit.
Yeah, you can bring it down. Like I've thrown a reduced Mind Flayer at a party of level 4 characters, and they did just fine.
Yeah, so there are a lot of ways that you can handle that, but unless you're crazy like Walker, I recommend using something like Kobold Fight Club.
There's another option, which Matt Colville, MCDM, on this shirt actually, put out, which is called Action-Oriented Design, which I particularly love because
Absolutely.
it takes a fight between a party and a singular creature, or maybe a couple creatures, and gives them story beats in the fight to interact with the characters. So maybe you have 4 players that are all attacking the same monster, and that monster would go down super fast if it was a normal monster. But instead, you add other abilities, and maybe it has a introduction ability, like it burrows up from the ground and explodes in between several of the squishier characters. That's an immediate threat that determines a important thing about what the character can do, and it opens up other possibilities for a later portion of the fight. I really like stringing story through my combat encounters. So if you can, if you look it up and watch it, I think it's a very engaging description of how you can take what would be a normal D&D encounter and add a bit of flair to it, that also forces your players to think more about, okay, yeah, we understand the mechanics of the game, but really what is happening here in the fiction, and how do we engage with that fiction?
There's now a link to that video in the chat. I highly recommend it. MCDM, they put out a lot of great videos on running the game. But I definitely recommend that video in particular. A lot of all of the main boss battles that I wrote for my last campaign for like the last 6 months were action-oriented design. So the fight that you guys had against the Emperor, the evil Emperor of Korva, and his Necromancer Wizard, that was action-oriented. The fight between Rob's character's ex-girlfriend and her minions was action-oriented. And those were some of the best fights that I've ever run in my life.
Yeah.
And Steven, the kind of Minotaur goat beast thing that you fought in the temple was action-oriented design.
Yeah, that one hurt.
Did you see the reaction right there? That's what you get from the action-oriented encounters. It's dynamic, and it forces your characters to think on their feet, and I love that.
It really does. Yeah, so I can't recommend that system enough. If you don't need to do something fully homebrew, go for the Mythic Odysseys of Theros system with the mythic traits. That's a really nice sort of in-between sort of thing. It lets you do a couple of fun things. You get to give them 1 extra traits and like a couple hundred hit points. That sort of thing is a nice in-between. You don't necessarily have to go through the whole process of action-oriented design. But that being said, action-oriented design is a lot faster than creating homebrew NPCs the way that D&D recommends. And it's a lot more fun. It's like, what would I not want to fight? This.
See, I like that because the way I do things in my head is there's the thing that you have in your mind that if everybody's played D&D enough, you know what it is, you know what its saves are, you know what you're going to do to it. I make greater and lesser versions of it. And it fucks with players' heads because they'll come into an encounter and see something they should be in no way or form fighting against, and it's there, and
Yep.
they've got to deal with it.
Yep.
And
Hey, it's a purple worm, and we're level 6.
what are we gonna do?
Yeah. So it's a lot of fun to play around with.
Yeah.
I definitely recommend it. It's one of my favorite things that MCDM has put out, in addition to their other books. But we'll not, we're not sponsored by them. I just like them very much.
If they did sponsor,
that'd be amazing. But anyways, thank you all very much for joining us for this episode of the GM Support Group. Again, I definitely recommend, if you aren't already, give the channel a follow. This month, as far as videos are concerned, are going to be a little more sporadic, perhaps. I can't guarantee that we'll have a video 2 weeks from now, and I can guarantee we won't have a video 4 weeks from now. The 29th, we are not doing a video. But give us a follow.
Consider finding a time this month to do like a one shot.
Was thinking about it. We're gonna have to look at Walker's schedule. We're gonna try and do some sessions actually, and show how things can be run, maybe of some different systems. Walker and I tested out Gumshoe a couple weeks ago and had a lot of fun with that. So there's a chance that we'll do some other things in addition to these normal shows. So give the channel a follow if you haven't already, and you'll get a notification every time we go live. In the meantime, thank you all so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one. Keep rolling your dice, and roll with advantage.